Katie. Katie, the movie. This is a documentary about Katie Taylor, which a lot of you will have seen. Some of you might not have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. If you have an interest in Katie Taylor or women's boxing, or if you just like good documentaries, it's quite good. I'd recommend it. I've watched it maybe 4 times myself, and it's a wet, miserable day, and I won't be going anywhere. So later on, I may watch it again. But there's one aspect of this movie, as they call them today. There's one aspect that I'd like to touch upon here. This film opens and you get a couple of minutes of you see Katie Taylor as she is today, and then it moves to when Katie Taylor was a young child, when she was a little girl, and she had to pretend she was a boy to be able to spar boys. And so it gets to that part, and at that point the credits begin to come up. And interspersed with the credits, you have this story of how Katie had to pretend to be a boy. And here's the point. At that point, suddenly you're presented with a man sitting, just a man, like I'm now to you. And this is a man called Johnny Waterson. And he writes for the Irish Times. He is the boxing person for the Irish Times. And just after the sequence where Katie is shown as a child having to bunch her hair up so people won't know she's a girl, just after that scene, this Johnny guy appears on the screen. Now, the Irish Times is a woke newspaper. It's a multicultural newspaper. It believes that Ireland is racist. It believes that transgender people are being persecuted. All of that stuff. It believes in a whole host of things that not very long ago it didn't believe in at all. But this man, he sits there and he says, and I've got it written here, he talks about men telling women what they should and should not do with their own bodies. Classic virtue signaling. Here's a man sitting there. You've seen the sequence where Katie, as a child, is not allowed to box because she's a girl. And here he is condemning that sort of ignorant, backward approach. And of course, he's showing you that he is not like that. He's a modern, cosmopolitan man. And if Katie Taylor had been back, he would have played a race card. Because that's what people like this do. And if she had been a transgender child or something, he'd have thrown in a bit of transphobia, because that's what these people do. Now, as I said, it's a very good documentary, but it is slightly irritating. You've got people like this Johnny Waterson, maybe 6, 7, 8 times in the film, sort of at critical points, they suddenly turn up on the screen to condemn, white men who were involved in running boxing, to condemn them as backward or ignorant or misogynist or something like that. These people, they turn up and they virtue signal. They present themselves as tolerant, inclusive, diverse, all of that. And while sidelining and bullying and marginalising and intimidating usually white working class men. But what this man says, men telling women what they should and should not do with their bodies. You see, this claim is a lie. It's not true. In boxing, men have never, ever told women what they can or cannot do with their bodies. And people who believe this, well, a lot of people are just ignorant. A lot of people have opinions that they've never ever thought out. But the likes of Johnny Waterson, the woke people, they know what they're doing. These are people who have no interest in the truth. They've no interest in boxing. They've no interest in vulnerable minorities. They just like the virtue signal. But to get back to the meat of this, men have never, ever, ever in boxing, they've never told women what they cannot do with their bodies. Society has told women what they can and cannot do with their bodies. And half of society, approximately, is female. And the reality is that up until very recently, you would have found it very, very difficult to find a single woman who would have been in favour of women's boxing. It would have been very, very rare. And there's a good reason for this. For just about all of human history, the idea of women and young girls in particular involving themselves in a sport that involved getting beaten, sometimes dangerously so, in the stomach and that general part of the body. Up until very recent times, nobody would have, or virtually nobody, would have been in favour of women's boxing. And there's a good reason for this. This had nothing to do with ignorance or anything like that. Up until, birth control only really came around in the 60s. And prior to that, for most of human history, a woman's job, if you like, a girl's job, was to reproduce, to have babies. Now this, by the way, had nothing to do with misogyny. It had nothing to do with anyone exploiting them. This was just nature. This was just biology. This was human survival. For virtually all of human history, life was short, life was brutal. Most babies born, well, they died at birth or soon after birth. And so, for most of human history, the idea that, a woman would be beaten around the stomach or beaten anyway, that would not have been an acceptable thing. So, men have never said, they've never told women what they can and cannot do with their bodies. Society has. And as I say, society is 50% women. But of course, the narrative, it's a very convenient narrative to blame men. In this case, in boxing, to blame particularly working class men, because it's a working class sport largely. It's a cheap way to virtue signal. And to say, look at me, I'm modern, educated, urbane, multicultural, tolerant, diverse. I'm not like those ignorant, backward people who used to live in the past. But all of this is based on lies, because, there is a reason why women's boxing wasn't a thing for most of human history. There's a reason, and there are good reasons, very good reasons. If you were, as I said, the job of women, if you like, was to have babies, and women were pregnant most of the time. And that had nothing to do with injustice or exploitation, nothing. It was simply a biological fact. And you find very few people in human history who would have been happy with the idea of, let's say, their daughter getting smashed in the stomach. And and we're beginning to see with this bubble, we're beginning to actually hear what goes on in the ring, and you hear those punches to the body. Now, if you're growing up in a situation where the expectation is that a woman will meet a man, get married, have children, if you're living in a world where that's the main focus of a woman's life, and you've got, let's say, limited medical knowledge, you're going to be opposed to women engaging in a sport that involves being thumped in the stomach. Anyhow, I'm rambling on a bit, but the point I'm making is that in this documentary, there are points. Now, it's a good documentary, it's a good film, you'll enjoy it. But there are these sort of key points, these parasites, these bullies and thugs and neo-fascist parasites turn up, just to let you know that they're modern, they're inclusive, they're intelligent people, not like the ignorant backward sort of people who were involved in boxing. And they condemn this discrimination or that discrimination about women, or the fact that women don't get paid as much as men. And by the way, women in boxing get the same pay as men. And they always have. Now you might think, well, that's silly. So just think about it. Think about it. That's all you have to do. So, but this is the reason I made this video. Is, you see, it's not just this documentary. This is creeping into all sports now. The parasites. Instead of celebrating the fact that women's boxing is on the boil, that it's doing great, instead of that, these people are jumping. They're parasites. They see this opportunity to get in there and push their agenda. Look at me, I'm woke. I'm woke. I'm tolerant. I'm inclusive. All that stuff. And spoiling sport. For instance, I don't watch football now. I couldn't. I can remember just a few months ago sitting down and there was an Irish women's team was on television. And I was just getting into women's football in the last, I think, 2 years. Excuse me. Just getting into women's football and here in Ireland. But there was very little on the television. But I was getting into it. And I'd say a few months ago, sat down to watch. I saw, flicking the channels, I saw, a girls' football team, an Irish women's football team. And I thought, this will be good, I'll watch this. And then they started bending the knee. And I just switched off. And of course, it would be fascinating to know how many women on the Irish football team have any idea what Black Lives Matter is actually about. I can only assume that none of them, not a single one of them, have even checked out the website. Anyhow, and all this stuff, it's ruining sport. It's ruining it. And of course, Mr. Johnny Watterson, I'll leave you with one thought. What if, and I would love this to happen, I would love a young man with a hairy chest to identify tomorrow, a young boxer, a young hairy chested male boxer who was lightweight, let's say. I would love a lightweight boxer like that tomorrow to identify as a woman and get in the ring with Katie Taylor and smash her. I'd love that to happen. But say that was to happen. And Katie Taylor said, I'm not fighting that man. He's a man. He's not a woman. What would happen? Well, let me tell you what would happen. This man, Johnny Watterson, and all the other parasites, they would turn on Katie Taylor in the blink of an eye. They would be the first to shout transphobia. They would bully her, they would abuse her, they'd marginalise her, they would slander her. They would destroy her in the blink of an eye. Now, some people have tried to do that on a different issue with Shannon Courtenay. You know, Shannon Courtenay tweeted something 9 years ago or retweeted something innocuous. And these parasites went after her. Now, Courtenay seems to have survived. To some extent because a lot of people in boxing, working class, and they won't tolerate this rubbish. So, but there you are, just some thoughts on this documentary. But it's a good documentary, as I say. It's quite good. But it's, you know, this woke agenda, these parasites, you know, they can't just celebrate the fact that women's boxing is doing great. They have to. They have to bully and marginalize someone. And they'll get around to you eventually. No matter who you are. You said the wrong word, expressed the wrong opinion. And these people will come after you. Take care.